I'm Lesley Riddoch. I'm here in the Mariel Centre in Shetland talking about the book Blossom, which is really looking at the people of Scotland and asking what it would take for Scotland to flourish, irrespective really of the referendum, but in ourselves, how do we become empowered, resilient, happy, cheeky folkies that we could well be. That's really what the book's about.
In your book Blossom, you passionately espouse the idea of a fair and egalitarian society as forwarded in the SNP agenda. It could be argued that nationalism has caused war and genocide throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. What has changed?
As far as nationalism is concerned, I'm also not a nationalist. I was a supporter of independence, like many people, for a whole stack of reasons. One was because I think we have a distinctive political culture that seems to have no expression within Britain. Now, if it were possible for it to find expression, I wouldn't be wanting an independent Scotland, actually. We're a right size for a useful sort of society, and we see that by comparison with a lot of our 5 million sized neighbours. If we were a different size of country, that might affect some of my thinking, not a huge amount, but somewhat. And I think the key point about all of this is that what's happened in Scotland is a civic nationalism. I mean, this is not a novel point to make, but it's probably why a movement has begun. At the beginning, unquestionably, the whole independence campaign was a top-down, party-led SNP affair. It could be no other because that's how Britain works. But the astonishing thing, the truly astonishing thing, is that by the end it became a movement, and it's still a movement, which will probably be the challenge for all parties over the next couple of years.
In the 50s, Isaiah Berlin developed the notion of positive freedom, acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purpose. You actually seem to be echoing that philosophy.
Absolutely. I'm a practical person, and I think people begin to understand the nature of the limitations of their world by trying to change it. And in the action of doing that, you become politicized. It's too often a kind of bit of a beard-pulling exercise where people begin to consider how things could be different from a completely inert stance. And it may just be a personal affectation or a thing of mine, but having been involved in things like the Isle of Egg buyout, for example, no amount of sitting discussing in the abstract how useful a community buyout, none of that would have created anything like the change that people finally realising it was absolutely up to them to act now created in Scottish society. So I'm a far bigger believer in doing, when doing and then finding a reason to think, and believing that well-educated, right-minded people will usually call on some pretty good instincts actually in those moments.
Should political economics be local?
No. It's more a question of where the grounding of it should begin. At the moment, I think we're missing grounding, so that many of the economics that we try to pursue or the political theories that people advance are basically a bit like trying to hammer in tent pegs into sand. There's nothing there. And whilst you can probably do that for quite some time before the whole thing comes tumbling down, it strikes me that we just have got no capacity at the kind of ordinary level so that people can begin to understand theories by just application to their everyday lives. And in a dispiriting environment, which is what people grow up in, it's almost as if people, to become political, are forced to leave home, quite literally so. Not just at the mundane level of having to leave to become a councillor in the biggest council units in Europe, but in a sort of almost emotional sense, people have to leave behind them what seems to be a disempowered and disempowering space to be able to become actors in the world. I couldn't think of a worse lesson to be giving anybody than that the place that basically gave birth to them, that shaped them, that gave them the outlooks and aspirations they have, is a worthless domain. And that's what we've done in this country. We've created specialness away. My grandmother said very proudly at one point in Wick, it's a family of leavers we've got. And that was an achievement. What an appalling indictment on us that we think that's, and we're still thinking that. to leave to become political is what people expect to do. That's just wrong.
Did the BBC influence the outcome of the referendum?
Yes, it did, along with pretty well everything else in the British state. I think myself the bigger problem for the BBC, which I left before the referendum, has been a sort of uncritical acceptance of an establishment agenda in everything. And the referendum just rolled into town and became just another of those agendas. You could have seen what was likely to happen from the way it dealt with everything since the Iraq War. And the confrontation with the government then and the resignation of Greg Dyke pretty well represented a corporation that had lost its bottle. I could see that working within the BBC, within news. All sorts of controversy was just edged away from. Safety was the paramount objective, and the belief that people could really discuss things just became a sort of, that wasn't anything that was interesting. Format became all important. So the Beeb only dealt with the referendum the way it's dealt with everything over the last sort of 10 years for sure. And yes, it did influence the outcome. It found it impossible to create genuine balance, so that, for example, by the time that the Yes movement had become clearly the quite almost at times evangelical and extraordinary upbeat movement that it became, it couldn't be reported on because there wasn't anything equal on the other side to report. And I know of many cases where people, myself included, were asked if we could recommend good no groups or good no business speakers or good no local contacts so that the Yes story could be told. Now, there's an awful lot of very big rethinking, in addition to all the criticisms that were made by the University of the West of Scotland about the personalising of the campaign, the constant negativity, the over-reporting of speeches by Gordon Brown, for example, who I think made the same speech 4 times, each time announced as a new entry into the independence debate. It seems that the great and the good are allowed to dictate the news agenda unreflectively, uncritically, and everybody else is basically guilty until they prove themselves innocent. And that's not good enough in any democracy under any circumstances. So yes, that definitely wounded the Yes argument to constantly be on the back foot.
And how do we further the youth engagement which the referendum engendered?
Well, I would think by having some young people as MPs in 2015. There's no way to do this other than to hand power to groups, and to expect young people to come in on sort of old people's terms, if you like, is unhelpful and counterproductive. And you'd need to change structures for that to happen. As I was saying tonight, in Norway, 1 in 80 Norwegians stands for election. In Scotland, the figure is 1 in 2,000. The greater number who stand in Norway tend to be young people and women because they need to be nearer home. How does that work? Because they have ultra small municipalities which are very powerful. Why does that not work here? Because if you want to be a councillor, you've got to go to Inverness. So there's quick answers to it, which is that young promising people should be given the chance to spread their wings, if you like. Perhaps that would be more fairly done in the Scottish Parliament context, because Westminster might be too much of a banishment, I guess, for many young people. But we need to change structures so that it becomes normal for people to stay where they are and begin to become politically active younger.
What is it about Scandinavian politics that you consider such a template for Scotland's political future?
There's a couple. They have had a fortunate past, which we cannot now reverse our own story to emulate. They didn't have, for example, Norway didn't have feudalism. We did, and we still do. We are still feudal, and we don't recognise it. Probably the biggest thing that the Nordics, and particularly Norway, has to offer Scotland is a comparator, is a mirror, something that you can look at and realise is probably us that's weird, not them, because we have sat and cooked with our problems for such a long time. We don't even regard them as remarkable. They are unbelievably remarkable, and our neighbours are the nearest mirror that shows that to us. But the main thing that they have done is place equality at the centre of their governance. And they've done that since roughly the 1920s and 1930s, when they took a tumble to themselves and realised they would have to make that kind of change in the dynamics of their countries, in Norway's case, to realise the purpose of being independent at all. And when you see how that dynamic works in the welfare state, where it keeps the quality of services high, so that the affluent remain part of the welfare state, use services that everyone uses. That keeps social solidarity high, it keeps support for welfare high, it keeps people paying taxes, that keeps levels of trust high. These are all virtuous circles instead of the vicious circle that we've got into. So if I had to choose, actually, whilst the localism, the genuine local power is attractive, the single most important lesson is placing equality as your #1 social policy goal.
Will we see Riddoch in Scottish politics?
Well, Riddoch is in Scottish politics, actually. You know, the point for me, the thing is, Scottish politics is not necessarily trapped in a parliament, a palace, or a council chamber, actually. And the party structures mean that if I was currently a member of any of those parliaments, A, you wouldn't be speaking to me because I would be long gone into the minutiae of some legislation. B, you wouldn't know what I think anymore because I'd have had to have toned it down. And there's probably a C, but I can't think of it. But the point is, it needs some people to stand, I think, out with party structures to be able to, if you like, articulate when these guys get it wrong. And they are going to get it wrong because they are bound by the need to propel a party set of interests, not necessarily those of the public. And whilst that's the case, I find it hard to see how I could be a member of any parliament, because you actually have to be a member of a party to get elected. And I think we'll find that whilst people have talked about having a Yes alliance for the Westminster elections in 2015, I think we'll find that that's not going to prove possible quite soon.
Thank you very, very much, Lesley Riddoch, for talking to us this evening. Thank you for your time.